In mid-September 1944, the GIs of the 1st Infantry Division felt invincible. They had raced across France, convinced the German army was broken and the war would be over by Christmas. Now, they were the first Allied infantry to cross into the Reich itself. But as they advanced through the gentle hills outside the city of Aachen, their momentum died. Before them, stretching to the horizon, were thousands of bizarre concrete teeth arranged in silent, perfect rows. It was an alien landscape. For the soldiers on the ground, it was a baffling curiosity. For their commanders, it was a problem that had to be solved. Fast. This was Germany's Westwall, better known as the Siegfried Line. But according to Allied intelligence, it was a propaganda bluff, a paper wall from the 1930s, manned by second-rate troops. With total air superiority and a 5-to-1 advantage in armor, the advance should have been unstoppable. So how did this obsolete line of concrete and steel halt the most powerful army in the world for months? The belief in a paper wall was a symptom of a much larger problem: victory disease. After the stunning breakout from Normandy, Allied high command was gripped by a dangerous euphoria. The German army appeared to be in a state of terminal collapse, and the prevailing mood was that the war would be over by Christmas. But this perception of invincibility masked a critical, grinding reality. The logistical network, the famous Red Ball Express, was stretched to its breaking point across 400 miles of liberated France. On the front lines, the truth was stark. The 1st Infantry Division was critically short on heavy 155mm artillery shells, the very ammunition needed to crack concrete. Fuel was so strictly rationed that some armored units were simply immobilized, waiting. Infantry companies, bled heavily since D-Day, were often at half strength, and with autumn's cold rain beginning to fall, there were no winter uniforms. This was an army built for a high-speed pursuit, and its intelligence reflected that. They had no detailed blueprints of the pillboxes, no tactical training on how to assault them, and none of the specialized demolition equipment required for the job. They were about to fight a siege, but they had arrived ready for a sprint. And so, with limited supplies and even less information, the order came down from 1st Army headquarters. It was simple: probe the line. The assumption was that one hard push would be enough to make the defenders abandon their posts and run. On September 13th, the 1st Rifle Companies advanced. Engineers blasted gaps in the Dragon's Teeth, and the infantry pushed through, expecting to find demoralized defenders. Instead, there was silence. Then, the hillsides came alive. Machine gun fire erupted from positions they had marched right past, bunkers disguised as farmhouses, or concrete slits hidden in the folds of the terrain. Each pillbox was designed to cover its neighbor, creating lethal, overlapping killing zones. Aerial photos had shown nothing. Patrols had seen nothing. The shocking truth hit the platoon leaders. The Dragon's Teeth weren't the wall. They were just the doorbell. The probing attacks collapsed in minutes. The GIs were trapped in the open, and the Siegfried Line had just drawn first blood. The immediate problem wasn't the machine guns, it was the concrete. To even reach the pillboxes, the GIs first had to cross hundreds of yards of open ground, then breach the Dragon's Teeth. This was a job for the combat engineers. Under a constant drizzle of mortar shells and sniper fire, small teams crawled forward. Their work was terrifyingly methodical. They carried specialized M3-shaped charges, nicknamed beehives, designed to focus an explosive blast. The process was agonizingly slow. Place the charge against a concrete pylon, rig the fuse, crawl back, detonate. The explosion would shatter one tooth. Then they'd do it again and again, all to clear a single, narrow lane for a Sherman tank. A tank now sitting exposed, a perfect target for unseen German anti-tank guns. Progress wasn't measured in miles, but in feet per hour. For the GIs who made it past the Dragon's Teeth, the real challenge loomed. The German pillbox, or Regelbau, was an engineering marvel of defensive warfare. 6 feet of steel-reinforced concrete could shrug off direct hits from most American field artillery. The structure was low profile, often sunk into a hillside and camouflaged. The only visible points were the tiny firing slits, or embrasures, which gave the German machine gunner inside a wide field of fire while presenting an almost impossible target from the outside. They were sighted with geometric precision, using the natural contours of the land to create interlocking fields of fire, leaving no dead ground, no safe approach. Standard infantry tactics were suicide. A frontal charge against a regelbau was a death sentence. Out of desperation, a new form of combat evolved on the muddy slopes of the Westwall. Small, specialized bunker-busting teams were born. The system was improvised on the spot. First, a support squad would find a position to lay down overwhelming suppressive fire with Browning M1919 machine guns, aiming directly at the firing slits. The goal wasn't to destroy the bunker, but to force the defenders to duck, to stop them from firing for just a few precious minutes. In that window, the assault element would move. Crawling through mud and shell craters, they carried the new tools of this siege. Bangalore torpedoes to blast through barbed wire, M2 flamethrowers to shoot liquid fire into the narrow slits, and the ultimate weapon, a satchel charge, a canvas bag packed with 20 pounds of C2 explosive carried by one man. Inside these concrete tombs were not the elite panzer grenadiers the GIs had fought in Normandy. The defenders of the Aachen sector were a mix of second-line units, the Landesschützen, made up of older men, and fortress infantry battalions filled with convalescing veterans and teenage boys with minimal training. Their letters and diaries express a grim determination, but also shock that the Americans would attack the Westwall at its strongest points head-on. But they held two decisive advantages. They were fighting from prepared positions they knew intimately, with every slope and gully pre-sighted for their mortars and artillery, and they were defending German soil for the first time in the war. Every American advance was met with a perfectly coordinated storm of steel, called in on positions plotted months or even years before. This revealed the brutal genius of the system. It wasn't a wall, it was a web. An American assault team, after a heroic and costly fight, might finally reach a pillbox. They'd silence the machine gun, use the flamethrower, and blast open the thick steel door with the satchel charge. But the moment they neutralized that one bunker and emerged, thinking they had won, they would be caught in a perfectly aimed crossfire. Two other pillboxes, unseen but positioned specifically to cover the first one, would open fire. The grim lesson was learned in blood. Taking a single bunker wasn't a victory. It was merely springing the next part of the trap. The Americans were slowly, agonizingly learning how to break the individual pieces of the puzzle. But their commanders were learning a different, even more horrifying lesson about the ultimate cost of solving it. At 1st Army Headquarters, the maps showed a slow, agonizing crawl forward. Pillboxes were marked as neutralized, but the casualty lists told a different story. The cost for each yard gained was staggering, with casualty rates approaching those of the First World War. Then, the horrifying strategic truth became clear. The Siegfried Line was not a wall meant to be held. It was a grinder, designed by its pre-war architects to trade cheap concrete for an attacker's blood. The GIs were winning the tactical battles, but losing the war of attrition. Every captured bunker was a victory that brought the army one step closer to ruin. This brutal arithmetic was calculated by men on the ground. For one assault team, the world shrinks to yards of mud and tangled wire, the air filled with the sharp crack of machine gun rounds snapping just overhead. Their only lifeline is the steady roar of a Browning, chewing at the pillbox's concrete slit. On signal, the flamethrower man runs, a desperate 30-yard dash. A terrifying whoosh as liquid fire engulfs the opening, and the German gun falls silent. The demolition team sprints for the rear steel door. The ground heaves as their 20-pound satchel charge blows it inward. A tense pause. It's over. The exhausted survivors slowly get to their feet, and in that instant, a different machine gun opens up, from a bunker they never saw, 200 yards away. It had been watching the whole time. So the answer was never in the concrete itself. The Siegfried Line became a fortress because it was the center of a perfect storm. Here, Allied overconfidence and exhausted supply lines collided with German desperation on home soil. A brilliant defensive system, designed to be lethal even in the hands of second-rate troops, met an attacking army utterly unprepared for a siege. The Westwall's real purpose was never to hold, but to trade ground for blood. The race across France was over. The war of attrition had begun. They had raced 400 miles across France in a single month. Now, they were fighting and dying for 400 yards of German earth.